All right, a happy Saturday. Today we're going to cover the Unit 1 Part 3 content, the last bit of Unit 1 that we haven't gotten through. This is going to be all four of the matter cycles. So we're going to cover the carbon cycle, nitrogen, phosphorus, and the water cycle. We start with the carbon cycle because that one is largely the biggest one we'll talk about when it comes to human impacts and effects on contributing to global warming as well as climate change. It's good to understand all the different aspects of the carbon cycle, but we can essentially simplify it into the idea of sources and sinks. A source is anything that puts carbon into the atmosphere, and a sink is going to be anything that takes it out of the atmosphere. The atmosphere being one of the key carbon reservoirs, especially when we talk about contributors to global warming and climate change. Any carbon that's produced and enters the atmosphere is going to have that impact of warming the atmosphere. So for the variety of different processes that happen, largely the natural ones are kept in balance and kept in check by natural processes. The biggest thing we're going to talk about is the extraction of fossil fuels and combustion as a source of carbon that is taking carbon, putting it into the atmosphere at a much faster rate than it can be removed from the atmosphere. So all of the processes are outlined here. And then the next following slides are going to have some details on some of those processes. So we'll start with photosynthesis and cell respiration. Photosynthesis being a process that takes it out of the atmosphere, making that photosynthetic process for plants a carbon sink. Cell respiration by plants and animals would technically then be a source of carbon into the atmosphere. Since both are relatively quick, right? Plants are constantly photosynthesizing, plants and animals are constantly doing cell respiration. There's no increase in the atmosphere between those two processes. They've been in balance for a very long time, throughout the history of biology for the most part, and at least as far as humans are concerned. This is not an area of concern as far as adding carbon to the atmosphere. So the idea that more people, more animals are throwing that balance off is not really something that we'll talk about. We'll talk about the human processes that are adding carbon to the atmosphere otherwise. Now, one thing that is probably new for you in this course is the idea of the ocean being a carbon sink. Now, the ocean does take in carbon from the atmosphere, and it also does put carbon into the atmosphere as well through the respiration from aquatic animals and plants, as well as just the dissolved CO2 escaping into the atmosphere. Now, when we look at increasing atmospheric CO2 from human processes, as the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere increases, it means that the concentration of CO2 in the ocean is also going to increase. This increased CO2 leads to ocean acidification. And ocean acidification has impacts on coral and the other animals, especially the ones that are responsible for taking carbon out of the ocean and rely on it to make their shells. If the ocean becomes too acidic, they are unable to keep the balance of pulling in CO2 to make their shells. Their shells start to react with the extra acid that's in the ocean, and the ocean being too acidic, lower on the pH scale. That can have some negative impacts on those organisms, and especially when we talked about corals, corals being a massive, excuse me, corals being a massive source of housing algae and being productive ecosystems. So without corals, we start to lose some of the primary productivity that's the base of the food webs in the ocean. Some carbon does get stored in the corals and in other organisms that use the carbon to form calcium carbonate shells. Some of it will also settle on the seafloor as sediment. Over long periods of time, that carbon-containing material basically just sits on the floor of the ocean and becomes a long-term carbon reservoir. Now, the process that humans are most responsible for in their effect on the carbon cycle is with the extraction and burning of fossil fuels. Fossil fuels take a very long time to form. Most of the fossil fuels that we look at were formed hundreds of millions of years ago. When those fossil fuels are extracted and then burned, so this is through processes that we'll get into more detail with later this year, the burning of coal and natural gas for electricity, the production of oil to be used in gasoline in cars, are humans' biggest impact on the environment. The production of CO2 from those processes is the largest contributor of CO2, man-made CO2 into the atmosphere, and is the direct contributor to what we would look at as the biggest contributors to climate change. With the nitrogen cycle, a process that we're probably not very familiar with, but the nitrogen cycle is a necessary thing. We need it to take nitrogen, which is largely in the air in an unusable form, and we rely on it to make nitrogen a usable form. So we use the term fixation. That nitrogen is fixed, meaning it's made usable for all organisms, which can then, starting with the producers, can take that nitrogen into their cells and into the organisms themselves up through the roots, and then that allows all of the other animals in the food webs to obtain nitrogen. As an animal, which we are, we have no ability to actually get nitrogen other than the process of consuming it. So the nitrogen cycle is similar in that there are sources and sinks. Sources release it into the atmosphere, sinks take it out of the atmosphere being, again, the largest reservoir. Now, the reservoirs themselves hold it for a very short period of time compared to the carbon cycle, and that's because that nitrogen is constantly circulating and moving through the different organisms. Now, the atmosphere, like I mentioned, is our main nitrogen reservoir, and the only abiotic process, meaning the only process that actually takes it out of the atmosphere without bacteria being involved, is through essentially the chemical reaction that might occur with lightning strikes. So that would be the abiotic fixation that's listed here. Lightning turns it into ammonia, as well as some fossil fuel combustion does take the nitrogen because it's at a very high heat, and does combine it with other compounds to add it into the to change it as well. But we are going to look at mostly biotic fixation. Nitrogen from the atmosphere gets into the soil through bacteria in the soil. And these bacteria are either in the soil or they can be in the root nodules of various plants that they have a relationship with. Now, some can make it into the soil as well in usable form through decomposition. So the nitrogen that was already in plants and animals that are being decomposed through another process will make it into a usable form. So our process here is only highlighting the atmospheric nitrogen and how it gets into the atmosphere. As we look at the other steps, the way that it gets into our food web is through a process we call assimilation, where the plants take it out of the soil. That's essentially the end of the soil's part of it, and then once it's in the food web, it's in the food web. How it can get there, like we mentioned, is through nitrogen fixation by bacteria in the soil, also through what's called ammonification. These are other bacteria, like I mentioned before, that are going to decompose and break down organic matter that's already got nitrogen in it. There's also going to be nitrification, where, as you can guess, other bacteria are going to take the ammonia compounds and turn them into nitrates and nitrites. Essentially, as you can see through the arrow of assimilation, this is the the end goal, is to get nitrates and nitrites into the food web, which is what the plants do, is they take it in for themselves, and then as the plants get eaten, and that nitrogen is able to move its way through the food web. So all of these processes convert it for their own benefit, and then other organisms have adapted to be able to use this, as well as relying on those bacteria and the processes they do. The only process naturally that puts it back into the atmosphere is one called denitrification. As the name suggests, it takes nitrates and those bacteria break them down and return that nitrogen into the atmosphere. Now, where humans have impacted the nitrogen cycle is through agricultural soils, and namely fertilizers. Agricultural fertilizers are largely nitrogen and phosphorus based, and we'll talk about phosphorus in the next set of slides. And the reason that fertilizers are used is because they help plants grow. And the reason they help plants grow fast is because they are readily available nitrates and readily available ammonia, right? One of the biggest agricultural fertilizers is ammonium nitrate. Now, those are the readily available ionic forms of nitrogen without the use of the bacteria to actually get to that stage. So it's ready for the plants to uptake once they get introduced and dissolved in water. So nitrous oxide can be produced as a result of this from denitrification very, very quickly, because as we have more readily available nitrates, we're also going to get more denitrification from the bacteria that would do that process, which means more nitrous oxide gets back into the atmosphere, and nitrous oxide is a greenhouse gas that contributes to warming. We also get leaching and runoff, where those nitrates and those nitrogen-containing compounds can make their way into a body of water when it rains, through the movement of water over those soils and into a larger body of water. And that leads to algae blooms, along with, very similar process happens with the phosphorus cycle. Algae blooms are not good. We'll talk about the process of eutrophication, where algae grows in bodies of water and ends up killing the organisms that live there by using up because bacteria use up all the oxygen, decomposing the algae that are there. Now, with the phosphorus cycle, one thing that they always seem to mention, I wouldn't say every test, but something that always comes up is the fact that the phosphorus cycle does not have a gas phase. So phosphorus that is unlocked in nature comes from rocks and sediments. Rocks and sediments are the major reservoirs. So because there is no gas phase where phosphorus does not enter the atmosphere, the process is very slow, and it relies on weathering and the breakdown of rock in order to dissolve phosphorus into water so that plants can then uptake it. Now, all organisms need phosphorus and rely on it. Phosphorus is used for ATP as well as building the backbone of our DNA. As I mentioned before, rocks are going to be the main natural source of phosphorus. So wind and rain have to weather it and break it down in order for it to get into the part of the food web. The synthetic sources come from mining as well as fertilizers, like mentioned before. Ammonium nitrate and ammonium phosphate are some of the main fertilizers that are used. So when phosphate is used as a fertilizer, that means that it's readily available for plant uptake. Phosphates can also be found in some detergents and cleaners and can enter waterways through household waste. Animal waste is also going to be a source of nitrogen and phosphorus for decomposition. Although depending on the area that we're talking about, where we are looking at, whether we're talking about a city, whether we're talking about on a farm, what has a bigger contributor to the local environment can depend on where you are. In farmland areas that use a lot of fertilizer, they're going to be they're going to be more responsible for the addition of nitrogen and phosphorus by humans. In cities where we're going to have large quantities of animals and large quantities of wastewater that's being treated and put back into the environment, that's where nitrogen and phosphorus are largely going to be coming from. Now, we go into more depth with eutrophication at different times throughout this year, but this slide here sums up the entire process and why we talk about it. So nitrogen and phosphorus enter the water, which causes algae, which is a plant, to bloom and essentially grow, because now they're one of their most limiting nutrients in the form of nitrogen and phosphorus are no longer limited. So as algae start to grow and cover the surface of the water, like you see in the picture to the left, they start to block out the sunlight from the other algae, which means that the other algae are going to start to die off because they can't do photosynthesis. As the algae die off, the bacteria that live in these aquatic ecosystems start to break them down, which is just a natural process. However, with more dead algae, you get more decomposition, and the process of decomposition by bacteria is an aerobic process, meaning they're using up oxygen in the water. As they start to use too much of the oxygen in the water, the dissolved oxygen levels decrease, and that means that the amount of oxygen available for small microorganisms like bacteria is unaffected, but for the larger organisms that have a higher oxygen demand, they start reaching a point where they're unable to get enough oxygen and start to essentially choke themselves in the water. This happens to large fish and marine organisms that will live in these areas. These are going to be common, these blooms of algae, in bodies of water, so like lakes, as well as areas where large quantities of nitrogen and phosphorus through runoff, so where rivers meet the ocean, can also occur. Good examples have over time have included the Gulf of Mexico as well as the Chesapeake Bay in Maryland as areas where large amounts of these nutrients have entered waterways and led to dead zones where all of the organisms have died because of a lack of oxygen in the water. And our last cycle is the water cycle. The water cycle has a couple of main parts, many of which we're familiar with in the form of precipitation, what we would call rain and snow, evaporation, and then the movement of water into the ground as well as into plants. This process is largely driven by the sun. The sun heating water leads to evaporation, and then as that water, those water molecules cool and condense, that creates the precipitation. So in theory, this process should just be an endless cycle. Our biggest concern with the water cycle is the fact that we have a very limited amount of fresh water on our planet. So the more water that ending up in the ocean and becoming salt water becomes less usable for us. Our usable fresh water is found in the form of lakes and rivers and streams, as well as underground aquifers, which we'll discuss in detail in another unit. Water enters the atmosphere through evaporation, as well as what's sometimes referred to as evapotranspiration or just transpiration. This is when plants open up their stoma to release water, and then that water then makes its way into the atmosphere. As plants release water, they pull water up from their roots. When the rain falls after entering the atmosphere, it has a couple of different things that can happen. So depending on the surface that it lands on, it can infiltrate into the ground, and we want water to infiltrate into the ground. This is the water that can become used by plants and soil organisms, and then eventually percolate its way through the ground and fill in underground aquifers and what we call recharge those underground aquifers, refilling them. When surfaces are paved over, your roads, your parking lots, anything that's pavement cement based, very little of that water is able to infiltrate the ground beneath it. It does not recharge those aquifers, and most of it ends up as runoff, meaning it's going into stormwater systems or into bodies of water that in theory and seemingly always end up in the ocean. So that is our end of our Unit 1 material. After we have our assessment on our Unit 1 material, we'll move into Unit 2, which focuses on the living world as well, but starts to talk about the organisms themselves and some of the evolutionary processes and adaptations they have, as well as how we study them in natural context. So thank you.